The gunshot that killed Josie O'Brien's father echoed through the canyon just as the first winter snow began to fall, leaving her alone in a one-room cabin with nothing but 17 flour sacks and a future that looked as bleak as the gathering storm clouds. She was 22 years old, and the Colorado mountains in 1881 were unforgiving to women without protection or provision. Her father had been a prospector, chasing dreams of silver through these treacherous peaks, until a claim dispute with a man named Carson had ended with her father bleeding out in the frozen mud. Carson had ridden away unpunished, as men like him often did, while Josie had dragged her father's body back to their cabin and buried him when the ground thawed enough to break. Now, 3 months later, she stood in that same cabin, staring at the empty shelves and the flour sacks she had carefully washed and folded. The fabric was surprisingly soft, stamped with faded logos and words that spoke of mills in distant cities she would never see. Her hands, rough from work and grief, traced the patterns as she considered her options. She could try to make it to Denver before the next snowfall, but the journey would take weeks, and she had no money for supplies. She could stay and try to work her father's claim, but winter was coming fast and she had barely enough food to last until spring. Or she could accept the proposal that had arrived yesterday, delivered by a nervous boy from the mining camp 10 miles south. A man named William Jensen, a mountain man and trapper who occasionally came down to trade his furs, had heard of her situation. He needed a wife, the letter said, plain and simple. He had a sturdy cabin, provisions for winter, and a life that was hard but honest. He would be at the chapel in Riverside, California, come spring if she was willing. The letter included enough money for passage west. Josie had laughed when she first read it, a bitter sound in the empty cabin. A marriage proposal from a man she had never met, offering her survival in exchange for companionship. But as the days passed and her supplies dwindled, the offer began to look less like desperation and more like providence. She wrote back, her hand shaking slightly as she formed the words. Yes, she would come. Yes, she would marry him, and yes, she understood this was a practical arrangement, nothing more. The money he had sent was enough for train passage, and a little extra, but not enough for luxuries, certainly not enough for a wedding dress. Josie looked at the flour sacks again, and an idea began to form. She had been sewing since she was 6 years old, making her own clothes and mending her father's shirts. The flour sacks were clean cotton, soft from washing, and there were enough of them. If she was clever, if she was patient, she could make something beautiful from these humble materials. She started that very night, working by lamplight as the wind howled outside. She carefully unpicked the seams of the sacks, transforming them into flat pieces of fabric. The logos and lettering had faded to soft shadows, giving the material an almost ethereal quality. She cut and pinned, measuring against her own body, creating a pattern from memory and imagination. The dress would be simple but elegant, with long sleeves and a high neck suitable for a modest bride. She used the strongest thread she had, making tiny, careful stitches that would hold even under strain. As winter deepened, the dress took shape. Josie worked on it every evening, sometimes late into the night, finding unexpected comfort in the repetitive motion of the needle, the steady transformation of something plain into something precious. She embroidered small flowers along the collar and cuffs, using thread she unraveled from an old shawl of her mother's. The work kept her hands busy and her mind occupied, pushing back thoughts of the stranger she would marry, the life she would leave behind, the father she would never see again. When spring finally broke through the last of the snow, Josie packed her few belongings into a canvas bag, folded the wedding dress carefully between sheets of brown paper, and began the long journey west. The train ride to California took 5 days, rattling through landscapes that shifted from mountain peaks to desert plains to green valleys. She sat by the window, watching America unfold before her, feeling both terrified and strangely hopeful. Every mile took her further from everything she had known, but also closer to a future that might hold something better than grief and solitude. Riverside, California was smaller than she expected, a dusty town nestled in a valley with mountains rising in the distance and a river cutting through like a silver thread. The air was warm and dry, so different from the thin, cold atmosphere of the Colorado peaks. She stepped off the train with her bag clutched in one hand and her dress package in the other, scanning the crowd for a man she had never seen. He was impossible to miss. William Jensen stood at the edge of the platform, like a mountain himself, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of muscled build that spoke of years of hard physical labor. His hair was dark brown and fell past his shoulders, tied back with a leather cord, and his face was weathered and tanned from constant exposure to the elements. He wore buckskin pants and a simple shirt that did nothing to hide the powerful frame beneath. His hands were large and calloused, and when his eyes met hers across the platform, she felt something unexpected flutter in her chest. He walked toward her with a fluid, easy gait, and she noticed how people moved aside to let him pass. There was something inherently commanding about his presence, a quiet strength that needed no announcement. When he stopped in front of her, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. They were hazel, she noticed, flecked with gold, and they studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Josie O'Brien. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, but not unkind. Yes, her own voice came out steadier than she felt. William Jensen? Just Will. He reached for her bag and she let him take it, feeling the brush of his fingers against hers. The wagon is this way. We can get married today if you are still willing, or you can take some time. I have arranged for a room at the boarding house if you need it. She appreciated the consideration, the acknowledgement that she might need space after such a long journey. But she had made her decision months ago during those long Colorado nights, and she did not see the point in prolonging the inevitable. Today is fine. I would like to change first, though. I made a dress. Something flickered in his expression, might have been surprise or curiosity, but he simply nodded. The boarding house has a room ready. I will wait. The boarding house was a simple but clean establishment run by a cheerful Mexican woman named Mrs. Garcia, who fussed over Josie like a mother hen, bringing warm water for washing and exclaiming over the wedding dress when Josie unwrapped it. You made this yourself? From flour sacks? Mija, it is beautiful. And it was beautiful, Josie thought as she slipped it over her head. The soft cotton fell in gentle folds to her ankles, the embroidered flowers catching the light from the window. It was not fancy, not like the dresses she'd seen in magazines or shop windows, but it was hers. She had created it with her own hands from the humblest of materials, and wearing it made her feel capable and strong. She brushed out her long, dark hair and pinned it up simply, tucking a few wild flowers that Mrs. Garcia had provided into the arrangement. When she walked out of the boarding house, Will was waiting beside a sturdy wagon hitched to 2 horses. He had been examining the wagon wheel, but he straightened when he heard her approach, and the expression on his face stopped her in her tracks. He stared at her as if seeing a vision, his eyes wide and something like wonder spreading across his weathered features. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You look like an angel. Josie felt heat rise in her cheeks, unexpected and warming. She had not expected compliments, had not even hoped for them. This was a practical arrangement, a business agreement disguised as a marriage. But the way he was looking at her, with such open admiration and something deeper she could not quite name, made her heart beat faster. It is just flour sacks, she said quietly. It is not just anything. He moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather and pine, and something wild that seemed to cling to him. You made this with your own hands? Yes, I've been sewing since I was a child. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and gently touched one of the embroidered flowers at her cuff. His fingers were surprisingly gentle for such a large man. These two? Yes. He looked up at her, and she saw something shift in his eyes, a deepening of interest that went beyond mere attraction. You are resourceful, strong. I'm glad you came, Josie O'Brien. The wedding was simple, held in a small chapel with Mrs. Garcia and her husband as witnesses. The preacher was an elderly man with kind eyes who led them through vows that felt both momentous and surreal. Josie repeated the words, promising to honor and cherish a man she had met an hour ago, and when Will spoke his own vows, his voice was steady and sure. He slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and she noticed his hands were shaking slightly. It made him seem more human, less like the untouchable mountain of a man he appeared to be. When the preacher told him to kiss his bride, Will hesitated, his eyes searching hers for permission. She gave the smallest nod, and he leaned down, pressing his lips to hers in a kiss that was brief and respectful, but carried an undercurrent of something that made her dizzy. When he pulled back, his hand lingered at her waist for a moment before he stepped away. They were married. Josie Jensen now, no longer Josie O'Brien. The name felt strange in her mouth, unfamiliar and new, but perhaps that was fitting. Everything about her life was unfamiliar and new now. Will's cabin was not in Riverside itself, but 15 miles into the mountains, accessible only by a winding trail that tested both the horses and Josie's nerves. She sat beside him on the wagon bench, acutely aware of his presence, the solid warmth of him, and the easy way he handled the reins. He pointed out landmarks as they traveled, his voice gradually becoming more comfortable as he talked about the land he clearly loved. "That peak there, that is Eagle's Reach. The hunting is good on the far side. And that stream, it runs year-round, never dries up even in summer. I built the cabin near it so we would always have fresh water." "How long have you been here?" Josie asked, genuinely curious. 5 years. Came out from Missouri after my family died. Fever took them all in one winter." His voice was matter of fact, but she heard the old pain beneath it. "I could not stay in that house anymore, so I came west, learned trapping from an old mountain man named Red Pete. He died 2 years back, left me his territory." "I'm sorry. About your family." He glanced at her and something in his expression softened. "And I'm sorry about your father. The letter said he was killed. A claim dispute." She kept her voice steady, though talking about it still hurt. "A man named Carson shot him and rode away. There was no law out there, no justice." Will's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. "There should have been. No man should die unavenged. What could I do? I'm one woman alone. Carson is probably in Mexico by now." "You are not alone anymore." He said it simply, as a statement of fact, but the words settled over her like a blanket. "You are my wife now. Josie, that means something to me. It means you have someone who will stand with you." She did not know what to say to that, so she simply nodded, feeling an unexpected tightness in her throat. They rode in comfortable silence for a while longer, the trail climbing higher into terrain thick with pine and oak. The air was cooler up here, fresher, and she could hear the sound of running water growing louder. The cabin appeared around a bend, and Josie felt her breath catch. It was larger than she had expected, built from solid logs with a stone chimney and a covered porch. The setting was beautiful, nestled in a clearing with the stream Will had mentioned rushing past just yards away. Mountains rose on all sides, creating a natural bowl that felt both protected and isolated. Wildflowers dotted the meadow grass, and she could see a small garden plot, already planted with neat rows of vegetables. "You did all this yourself?" she asked as Will helped her down from the wagon, his hands circling her waist easily. "Most of it. Had some help with the roof." He seemed almost shy now, watching her face for her reaction. "It is not fancy, but it is solid. Warm in winter, cool in summer, and safe." "It is wonderful," she said honestly, and saw relief flash across his face. Inside, the cabin was meticulously organized. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. A ladder led up to a loft space, and through an open doorway she could see a bedroom. The furniture was simple but well made, clearly crafted by hand. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with provisions and tools. It was a bachelor's home, practical and sparse, but clean and welcoming in its way. "I prepared the bedroom for you," Will said, setting her bag down near the door. "You can have your privacy. I will sleep up in the loft." Josie turned to look at him, surprised. "We are married." "Yes, but we do not know each other. I will not force myself on you, Josie. When you are ready, if you are ever ready, you can let me know. Until then, you have your own space." She studied him, this large, intimidating man who was offering her something precious, choice. In her experience, men took what they wanted, especially from their wives. The law certainly gave them that right. But here was Will, offering her safety and time, asking for nothing in return but her presence. She felt something shift inside her, a crack in the walls she had built around her heart. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, then seemed to shake himself. "You must be hungry. I can make supper. Nothing fancy, but it will fill you up." She watched as he moved around the kitchen with surprising grace for such a large man, building up the fire in the stove and pulling out ingredients. He worked efficiently, clearly used to caring for himself, and soon the cabin was filled with the smell of frying bacon and baking bread. They ate at the simple wooden table, and Josie found herself relaxing despite her nerves. Will was not much of a talker, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He asked about her journey, her life before, what she hoped for in this new situation. He listened more than he talked, and she appreciated that. After supper, Will excused himself to tend to the horses while Josie explored her new home more thoroughly. The bedroom he had given her was small but comfortable, with a real bed covered in quilts and a window that looked out over the meadow. Her flour sack wedding dress hung on a peg, and she ran her fingers over the soft fabric, thinking about the way Will had looked at her, the words he had spoken. "You look like an angel." She changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of Will moving around in the main room, the creak of the ladder as he climbed to the loft. The cabin settled into quiet, and she lay back, staring at the ceiling. She was married. She was in California. She was safe, at least for now. It was more than she had dared hope for during those dark Colorado nights. Sleep came easier than she expected. The next weeks fell into a pattern. Will rose early, often before dawn, and Josie would wake to the sound of him building up the fire and putting coffee on to boil. He taught her the rhythms of mountain life, when to check the traps, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds, which plants were edible and which were poison. He was patient with her mistakes and generous with his praise when she succeeded. She, in turn, brought order to his domestic life, cooking meals that were more than just fuel, mending his clothes with her careful stitches, making the cabin feel like a home rather than just a shelter. They were careful around each other at first, polite and formal, but gradually a comfortable companionship began to develop. Will would tell her stories about his trapping expeditions as they worked together in the garden, his voice rumbling low and pleasant. Josie would share memories of her childhood, the good times before her mother died, when life had been simpler. They laughed together over small things, a squirrel that raided the garden, Will's disastrous attempt to make apple pie, Josie's reaction to her first encounter with a skunk. But there were also moments of tension, of awareness. The way Will's hand would linger when he helped her over rough ground during their walks. The way Josie found herself watching him when he worked, admiring the play of muscles under his shirt, the competent way he handled everything from an axe to a needle. The way they would catch each other's eyes across the table and have to look away, both feeling something building between them that neither quite knew how to address. One evening, about a month after her arrival, a storm rolled in fast and fierce, the kind of mountain storm that turned day to night in minutes. Josie was in the garden when the first drops fell, and she ran for the cabin, but the rain caught her halfway. Within seconds she was drenched, her dress plastered to her body, her hair streaming down her back. She burst through the door, laughing despite herself at the sheer intensity of it, and found Will standing there with a blanket already in his hands. "You are soaked," he said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. His hands rubbed her arms through the fabric, trying to warm her, and suddenly they were very close, close enough that she could see the drops of water on his eyelashes, feel the heat radiating from his body. The laughter died in her throat. "Will," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for. His eyes searched hers, dark with something that made her stomach flutter. "Tell me to stop and I will." Instead of answering, she rose up on her toes and kissed him. It was nothing like the chaste kiss at their wedding. This was heat and need, and weeks of building tension finally finding release. His arms came around her, pulling her against him, and she felt the full strength of him, the contained power in his body. His mouth moved over hers with a hunger that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel alive in a way she had never experienced. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Will rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" "I am sure." And she was. This man had shown her nothing but respect and kindness. He had given her safety and space and time to heal. Now she wanted to give him something in return, and she wanted to take what she had begun to realize she needed: connection, closeness, love. He carried her to the bedroom, his arms steady and strong, and laid her down on the quilts with a gentleness that belied his size. What followed was tender and passionate, a claiming that was mutual, a joining that felt inevitable. Josie had heard stories from other women about the marriage bed, whispered warnings about pain and duty, But with Will, it was nothing like that. He was careful with her, patient, guiding her through the newness of it until the strangeness gave way to pleasure that left her gasping his name. Afterward, they lay tangled together, his large body curled protectively around hers, and Josie felt something inside her settle. This was right. This marriage that had begun as a desperate bargain had become something real, something precious. "I am glad you came west," Will murmured against her hair. "I am glad you said yes." "So am I," she whispered back, and meant it with her whole heart. From that night on, they shared the bedroom, and the cabin truly became a home. They fell into each other with a passion that surprised them both, but it was more than just physical desire. They talked long into the nights, sharing dreams and fears and hopes. Will told her about his childhood in Missouri, the brother who had died in the war, the sweetheart he had lost to fever. Josie told him about her mother's death when she was 12, the hard years that followed, her father's obsession with finding silver that had ultimately killed him. They learned each other's bodies and minds with equal curiosity. Will discovered that Josie was ticklish behind her knees and that she hummed when she was happy. Josie learned that Will had nightmares sometimes about his family's deaths and that he relaxed when she ran her fingers through his long hair. They built a partnership that was equal parts practical and romantic, working together during the day and falling into each other's arms at night. Summer deepened, and Riverside seemed like a distant memory, the mountain cabin its own world. Will taught Josie to shoot, standing behind her to adjust her aim, his arms guiding hers. She proved to be a natural, her hands steady and her eye keen. He also taught her to fish in the stream, and they would spend peaceful afternoons sitting on the bank, their lines in the water, talking or simply existing in comfortable silence. But the peace was not to last. In late July, Will came back from a trip to Riverside with supplies and a troubled expression. Josie knew immediately that something was wrong. "What is it?" she asked, helping him unload the wagon. He was quiet for a moment, his jaw tight. "I heard some news in town. A man named Carson has been asking around about you." Josie felt her blood run cold. "Carson? Are you certain?" "The description matches what you told me. He has been in the area for about a week, drinking in the saloons, asking if anyone knows a woman named Josie O'Brien who came from Colorado." "Why would he be looking for me?" Fear made her voice shake. "I have nothing he could want. My father had no claim worth stealing." Will's expression darkened, and she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. "Maybe it is not about a claim. Maybe he heard about you traveling alone to meet a husband and thought you might be an easy target. Or maybe he is just mean enough to want to tie up loose ends. What do I do?" "We stay alert. We stay together. And if he comes up here, we handle it." Will's voice was hard, protective. "You are my wife, Josie. I will not let him hurt you." She believed him, but fear still gnawed at her. Carson had killed her father without hesitation, without remorse. What would stop him from doing the same to her or to Will? She tried to push the worry down, to focus on daily tasks, but she found herself jumping at every unexpected sound, scanning the tree line whenever she was outside. 3 days later, Carson came. Josie was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the sound of a horse approaching. Will was checking his traps, not due back for at least an hour. She turned toward the sound, her hand instinctively going to the knife at her belt, and felt her heart drop as a man rode into the clearing. He was exactly as she remembered from that terrible day in Colorado. Medium height, wiry build, with a face that might have been handsome if not for the cruelty in his eyes and the sneer that twisted his mouth. He sat his horse with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences, and when he saw her, his sneer widened into a grin. Well, Josie O'Brien. Took me a while to track you down." "What do you want, Carson?" She kept her voice steady, her hand on the knife. He dismounted slowly, his hand resting on his gun. "Now, is that any way to greet an old friend? I just wanted to check on you, make sure you were doing all right after your daddy's unfortunate accident. You murdered him. It was not an accident. Murder is such a harsh word. We had a disagreement. These things happen." He looked around the clearing, taking in the cabin, the garden, the signs of life. "Looks like you landed on your feet, though. Heard you married some mountain man. Where is he?" "He will be back soon." "Good. I would like to meet him." Carson's grin turned nasty. See, the thing is, your daddy and I had some unfinished business. He owed me money. That is a lie. My father had no debts. Well, now, that is a matter of perspective. I see it different. And since he is not around to pay up, I figure the debt passes to you, or to your husband, now that you are married. So either you can pay me what's owed, or we can work out another arrangement. The way he looked at her made her skin crawl. She understood now what Will had suspected. Carson had not come for money. He had come because he was the kind of man who enjoyed having power over others, who got pleasure from causing fear and pain. He had killed her father and gotten away with it, and now he wanted to torment her too, because he could. "Get off my property," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "You are not welcome here." Carson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Your property? Honey, you do not get to tell me what to do." He took a step toward her, and she pulled the knife from her belt, holding it out in front of her with a steady hand. "Do not come any closer." "Or what? You're going to stick me with that little knife? I do not think so." He took another step, and Josie tensed, preparing to fight or run, she was not sure which. A gunshot cracked through the air, and dust exploded at Carson's feet. He jumped back, his hand going to his gun, and then froze as Will emerged from the tree line, his rifle leveled at Carson's chest. "The lady told you to leave," Will said, his voice colder than Josie had ever heard it. "I suggest you listen." Carson's eyes went wide as he took in Will's size, the deadly calm in his posture, the absolute certainty that he would shoot if provoked. "Now hold on, I am just here to talk, to settle a debt." "There is no debt. You murdered her father in cold blood, and now you come here making threats." Will moved forward, and despite the distance between them, Carson took a step back. "I know men like you, Carson. You are a coward and a bully. You prey on those who cannot fight back. But I can fight back. And if you ever come near my wife again, if you even think about her, I will hunt you down and make you wish you had never been born." "You are threatening me." Carson's voice cracked slightly. "I am making a promise. Now get on your horse and ride out of here. If you are still in California come sunrise tomorrow, I will consider that a declaration of war. Do you understand me?" For a long moment, Carson seemed to consider his options. His hand twitched toward his gun, and Josie's heart stopped. But then he saw something in Will's eyes that made him reconsider. He spat on the ground and turned toward his horse. "This is not over." "Yes, it is." Will did not lower the rifle until Carson was mounted and riding away, and even then he stood watching until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he turn to Josie, his expression transforming from deadly to concerned in an instant. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" She shook her head, suddenly feeling shaky now that the danger had passed. "No, but he was going to. If you had not come back when you did. I saw his horse prints on the trail. I came as fast as I could." He set the rifle aside and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his chest. She could feel his heart pounding, feel the tension in his muscles. "I should have been here. I should not have left you alone. You could not have known he would come." She pressed her face against his shirt, breathing in his familiar scent, letting his strength steady her. "Will, what if he comes back? What if he brings others? Then we will be ready. But I do not think he will. Men like Carson are only brave when they have the advantage. He knows now that coming after you means coming after me, and he does not want that fight." He pulled back slightly to look down at her, his hand cupping her face. "I meant what I said, Josie. I will protect you with my life if I have to. You are mine, and I take care of what's mine." The possessive words should have bothered her, but instead they made her feel safe, cherished. She rose up on her toes and kissed him, pouring all her fear and relief and love into it. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his breathing ragged. "Come inside," he murmured. "Let me hold you." They spent the rest of the day inside the cabin, Will's arms wrapped around her as if he could shield her from the world through sheer will. He made love to her slowly, thoroughly, reaffirming the bond between them with every touch and kiss. And afterward, as they lay tangled together, Josie realized something that felt both terrifying and wonderful. She loved him. This mountain man who had been a stranger 4 months ago had become the center of her world, the person she trusted most, the man she wanted to spend her life with. "Will," she whispered in the gathering darkness. "I love you." She felt him go still, And then he rolled to face her, his eyes intense even in the dim light. "Say that again. I love you. I did not expect to, but I do. You are everything good I did not know I needed." His hand came up to cradle her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with heartbreaking gentleness. "I love you too, Josie. I think I have loved you since I saw you step off that train, and I know I loved you when I saw you in that dress you made. You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You took flour sacks and made magic. You took this rough life I offered and made it a home. You took my loneliness and filled it with joy. I love you more than I have words to say." She kissed him again, tears slipping down her cheeks, and they made love again, slower this time, savoring each moment. They fell asleep wrapped in each other, and for the first time since her father's death, Josie felt truly at peace. True to Will's prediction, Carson did not return. Word came from Riverside a week later that he had been seen riding south toward Mexico, apparently deciding that whatever satisfaction he might get from tormenting Josie was not worth facing Will's wrath. Josie felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though she knew she would never entirely forget the fear of that encounter. Some scars ran too deep to fully heal. But life moved on, as it always did. Summer gave way to fall, and the mountains transformed into a riot of gold and red and orange. Will took Josie on longer expeditions, teaching her to track game and read trail signs. She proved to be an apt pupil, quick to learn and fearless in the face of challenges. They worked together to prepare for winter, smoking meat and storing vegetables and stocking the cabin with everything they would need to weather the cold months ahead. On a crisp October morning, Josie woke feeling strange, her stomach unsettled in a way that was becoming familiar. She had missed her monthly courses twice now, and her body was changing in small but noticeable ways. She had her suspicions, but she'd been afraid to voice them, afraid to hope. But as she sat up in bed, her hand going instinctively to her still flat stomach, she knew she could not ignore the signs any longer. "Will," she said softly, and he rolled over immediately, instantly alert. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "No, I am." She took a breath, suddenly nervous. "I think I am with child." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and her heart sank. Maybe he did not want children. Maybe this was not part of the plan. But then his face broke into the widest smile she had ever seen, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile. "A baby?" He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe. "Josie, truly? We are going to have a baby?" "I think so. It is still early, but all the signs are there." He pulled back, his hands immediately going to her stomach, his expression one of wonder. "There is a baby in there, our baby." "Yes." He kissed her then, deep and passionate, and then dropped to his knees beside the bed, pressing his face against her stomach. "I am going to be a father," he murmured, and she heard the awe in his voice, the sheer joy. "I never thought I would get this chance. After losing my family, I thought I was meant to be alone. But then you came, and you brought light back into my life. And now this, a baby, a family." Josie ran her fingers through his hair, her own eyes wet with tears. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Will, strong and protective and kind." "I'm going to build a cradle," he declared, looking up at her with shining eyes. "The finest cradle anyone has ever seen. And I will expand the cabin, add another room, and we will need more supplies, softer blankets, and—" She laughed, pulling him back up beside her. "We have time. The baby will not be here until spring." "Spring," he repeated, like it was a magical word. "Our baby will be born in spring." He kissed her again, gentle now, reverent. "Thank you, Josie. Thank you for saying yes to a stranger, for taking a chance on this life, for giving me everything I never dared to dream of." "You gave me those things too," she whispered. "You saved me, Will. In every way a person can be saved." The winter that followed was the happiest of Josie's life. Despite the snow that piled high around the cabin and the bitter cold that made venturing outside an ordeal, inside they were warm and content. Will was endlessly attentive, treating her like she was made of glass despite her protests that she was perfectly capable. He built the cradle he had promised, spending hours carving intricate designs into the wood, mountains and trees and animals, a representation of the world they would teach their child to love. He also expanded the cabin as promised, adding a room that would serve as a nursery. Josie sewed blankets in tiny clothes, marveling at how small they were, how impossibly precious. She used the last of her flour sack fabric to make a christening gown, embroidering it with the same care she had used on her wedding dress. It seemed fitting somehow that the fabric that had marked the beginning of her new life would also welcome her child into the world. They talked endlessly about the baby, debating names and wondering whether it would be a boy or girl. Will claimed he did not care either way, as long as the baby and Josie were healthy, but Josie noticed he seemed to lean toward boy names in their discussions. She did not mind. She would be happy with whatever child they were blessed with. As winter began to loosen its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, Josie's body grew heavy with the pregnancy. She moved more slowly now, her balance affected by the weight she carried, but she felt radiant. Will told her constantly how beautiful she was, how much he loved watching her nurture their child. He would spend hours with his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick and move, talking to the little one in his deep, rumbling voice. The baby came on a warm April morning, arriving with the sunrise and the sound of birdsong. Mrs. Garcia had come up to the cabin a week earlier, having been summoned by Will to help with the birth. She proved to be an invaluable presence, guiding Josie through the long hours of labor with steady encouragement and practical wisdom. Will was there too, holding Josie's hand, wiping her forehead, offering her water and support. He looked terrified, but refused to leave her side, even when Mrs. Garcia suggested he might be more comfortable waiting outside. "I'm staying," he had said firmly. "My wife needs me." And Josie had been grateful for his presence, for the strength of his hand in hers, for the love in his eyes, even when she screamed through the worst of the pain. When the baby finally came, slipping into the world with a lusty cry, Will wept openly, tears streaming down his weathered face as Mrs. Garcia placed the tiny, perfect infant in his arms. "A boy," she announced, smiling. "A strong, healthy boy." Will looked down at his son with an expression of such pure love that Josie felt her heart might burst. "He is perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." He brought the baby over to Josie, carefully settling the little one in her arms. "Look what we made, Josie. Look at our son." She looked down at the tiny face, the dark eyes that tried to focus on hers, the miniature hands that waved in the air, and felt overwhelmed with love. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "We have been waiting for you." They named him Thomas after Will's brother who had died in the war. Thomas Jensen, mountain baby, born with his father's strong build and his mother's dark hair. He was loud and demanding and absolutely wonderful, and both Josie and Will fell hopelessly in love with him. The months that followed were exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Thomas was a hungry baby, nursing constantly and sleeping in short bursts that left Josie feeling permanently tired, but she did not mind. Every time she looked at her son, every time Will held him with such careful tenderness, she felt blessed beyond measure. Will was an attentive father, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Thomas during fussy nights, singing to him in a surprisingly pleasant baritone. As Thomas grew, his personality emerged. He was curious and fearless, always reaching for things he should not touch, trying to put everything in his mouth. He laughed easily, especially when Will played with him, tossing him gently in the air or making funny faces. He adored his mother, crying when she left his sight, settling immediately when she picked him up. The cabin echoed with his sounds, crying, cooing, laughing, the endless babbling that would eventually become words. When Thomas was 6 months old, Will suggested they make a trip to Riverside so the baby could be properly welcomed by the community. Josie agreed, curious to see how the town had grown and to show off her son to Mrs. Garcia, who had returned home after staying with them for 2 weeks following the birth. The trip was longer than it used to be, with stops to nurse Thomas and change him, but it was pleasant. The weather was mild, and Thomas seemed to enjoy the journey, wide-eyed and alert as he took in the changing scenery. When they arrived in Riverside, they were greeted warmly. The town had grown since Josie's arrival, with new buildings and more families settling in the area. Mrs. Garcia fussed over Thomas, exclaiming over how much he had grown, how strong and handsome he was. They spent 2 days in town, restocking supplies and enjoying the change of pace. On the second evening, as they prepared to return to the mountain, a stranger approached them. He was an older man, well-dressed with the look of someone from back east. He tipped his hat politely to Josie and extended a hand to Will. "William Jensen, my name is Harold Mitchell. I am an attorney from San Francisco. I have been trying to track you down for some time." Will shook his hand cautiously. "What can I do for you, Mr. Mitchell?" "It is more what I can do for you. I represent the estate of Peter Jensen, who I believe was your uncle." Will's expression shifted to surprise. "Uncle Peter? I have not heard from him in years. I thought he had forgotten about me after my family died." "On the contrary, he thought of you often. When he passed away last year, he left specific instructions in his will. He had no children of his own, you see, and you were his only living relative. He left you his estate." "His estate?" Will repeated, looking confused. "Yes, a considerable sum of money, as well as property in San Francisco. He was a successful merchant, Mr. Jensen. Your uncle was a wealthy man, and he wanted you to have everything." Josie felt her knees go weak. She reached for Will's arm to steady herself, and he immediately wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. Thomas, sensing tension, began to fuss, and she automatically bounced him, trying to process what they were hearing. "How much money?" Will asked bluntly. Mr. Mitchell named a figure that made Josie gasp. It was more money than she had ever imagined, enough to live on comfortably for the rest of their lives, enough to ensure Thomas and any future children would never want for anything. "There must be some mistake," Will said. "Why would he leave me all that? I barely knew him." "He followed your life from afar. He knew about the tragedy that befell your family, and he felt guilty that he had not been there to help. This was his way of making amends, of ensuring you would be taken care of. He was very specific in his instructions. Everything goes to you, with the stipulation that it be used to build a good life for you and your family." Will looked at Josie, and she saw her own shock reflected in his eyes. "I do not know what to say." "Say you will come to San Francisco to settle the estate. There are papers to sign, property to inspect. It will take a few weeks, but then everything will be officially yours." They talked for a while longer, Mr. Mitchell explaining the details of the inheritance and what would be required to claim it. When he finally left, promising to arrange accommodations for them in San Francisco, Will and Josie stood in stunned silence, holding Thomas between them. "What do we do?" Josie finally asked. "I suppose we go to San Francisco," Will said slowly. "See what Uncle Peter left us. But Josie, I want you to know that this changes nothing for me. I do not need money or property to be happy. I have you and Thomas. I have everything that matters." She stood on her toes to kiss him, her heart full. "I know, and I feel the same. But this is a gift, Will. A chance to give Thomas opportunities, to secure our future. We should at least see what it is." So they made the journey to San Francisco, an adventure that took them away from their mountain cabin for the first time since Josie's arrival. The city was overwhelming after the quiet solitude of their mountain life. Crowded, noisy, bustling with activity. But it was also exciting, full of possibilities. The property Uncle Peter had left them was a beautiful house in a good neighborhood, well maintained and filled with quality furniture. The money, once the estate was settled, was deposited in a bank account in Will's name. They stayed in the city for 3 weeks, taking care of legal matters and exploring this new world. Will was uncomfortable in the city, too confined and crowded for his mountain man nature, but he endured it for Josie and Thomas. Josie found herself torn between fascination with the city's opportunities and longing for the simplicity of their cabin. Thomas, oblivious to the significance of it all, continued to demand attention and food and sleep on his own schedule, keeping them both busy. In the end, they made a decision that felt right for both of them. They would keep the house in San Francisco but not live there full time. Instead, they would rent it out, using the income along with the inherited money to improve their mountain property and provide security for their family. They would remain in their cabin, living the life they loved, but with the comfort of knowing they had resources if they ever needed them. "I want Thomas to grow up in the mountains," Will said as they prepared to return home. "I want him to know the freedom of that life, the beauty of it. The city is fine for visiting, but it is not for us." Josie agreed wholeheartedly. The city had been interesting, but it was not home. Home was their cabin by the stream, the mountains rising on all sides, the life they had built together from nothing. That was what mattered. They returned to the cabin in late summer, and it felt like breathing freely again after being underwater. Will immediately relaxed, his shoulders losing the tension they had carried in the city. Thomas, too, seemed happier, settling into familiar routines. Josie unpacked their things and looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes. They could improve it now if they wanted, add luxuries they had never been able to afford. But she found she did not want to change much. This place was perfect as it was, a testament to what they had built with their own hands and hearts. The years that followed were good ones. They used some of the inheritance money to expand the cabin further, adding a second bedroom for Thomas and a proper kitchen for Josie. Will bought more livestock and improved the garden, making their property more self-sufficient. But they kept the essence of their life unchanged, simple, close to nature, focused on family. Thomas grew into a strong, bright boy, as comfortable in the wilderness as his father. Will taught him to track and hunt, to respect the land and the animals that shared it. Josie taught him to read and write, using the books they brought back from San Francisco, and to sew and cook, believing that a man should be self-sufficient in all ways. He was a happy child, full of energy and curiosity, and both parents doted on him. When Thomas was 3, Josie became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, her body remembering what to do. Will was no less attentive, but he was less anxious, having been through it once before. They welcomed a daughter in the spring, a tiny, perfect girl they named Margaret after Josie's mother. She had Josie's dark eyes and Will's strong build, and from the moment she arrived, she had both parents wrapped around her tiny fingers. Thomas was initially suspicious of this new creature who demanded so much attention, but Will patiently explained that big brothers had important jobs protecting and teaching their little sisters. Within weeks, Thomas was fiercely protective of Margaret, always wanting to hold her, to show her his treasures, to include her in his play even though she was too small to participate. It was clear he took his role as big brother seriously. Life settled into a beautiful rhythm. Will continued his trapping, though he scaled back his expeditions now that money was not such a pressing concern. Josie managed the household and tended the children, finding joy in the daily routines of motherhood. They made regular trips to Riverside, maintaining connections with the community there, but they always returned gratefully to their mountain sanctuary. On Thomas's 5th birthday, they threw a party at the cabin, inviting neighbors from the surrounding area and friends from Riverside. Mrs. Garcia came, bringing food and stories. Other families arrived, children running wild in the meadow while adults talked and laughed. It was a perfect day, warm and sunny, filled with the kind of simple happiness that money could not buy. As Josie watched Will swing Thomas around while Margaret toddled after them laughing, she thought back to that desperate woman in a Colorado cabin, alone and afraid, wondering how she would survive. She thought about the flour sacks she had sewn into a wedding dress, the train journey west, the stranger who had become her whole world. She thought about how close she had come to giving up, to accepting that her life would be small and hard and lonely. Will caught her looking and smiled, that same wonderful smile that had greeted her on the train platform 5 years ago. He set Thomas down and walked over to her, pulling her into his arms despite the audience of friends and neighbors. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured against her hair. "About how lucky I am. About how everything that seemed terrible led me here, to you, to this life. I would not change anything." "Not even the flour sacks?" he teased gently, and she laughed. "Especially not the flour sacks. They brought me to you, did they not?" He kissed her then, in front of everyone, a deep, loving kiss that spoke of years of partnership and passion and devotion. When they broke apart, their friends were clapping and whistling, and Will blushed like a boy, making Josie laugh harder. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Will and Josie sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. He held her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm, a gesture so familiar it was like breathing. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The city? The possibility of a different life?" "Never," she said firmly. "This is exactly where I am meant to be. You are exactly who I'm meant to be with. I have everything I need right here." I love you, Josie Jensen. I loved you when you stepped off that train in a travel-worn dress. I loved you when I saw you in your flour sack wedding dress, looking like an angel. I loved you through the fear and the joy and the ordinary days. And I will love you until my last breath. I love you too, Will. You gave me a life when I had none. You gave me love when I did not know I needed it. You gave me a family and a home and a future. You are my everything. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the sounds of the mountain night, the rush of the stream, the hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the pines. Inside the cabin, their children slept safely, warm and loved and secure. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and joys, but tonight was perfect, a moment of peace and contentment that would sustain them through whatever came next. 2 years later, Josie gave birth to another son, whom they named Daniel. He was a quieter baby than Thomas had been, more contemplative, but equally loved. Thomas took his big brother duties seriously, always looking out for both Margaret and Daniel. Margaret was growing into a spirited little girl, full of questions and energy, keeping both parents on their toes. The cabin rang with the sounds of children, laughter and arguments and endless chatter. Will continued to be a devoted father, somehow finding enough time and energy for each child individually. He took Thomas on longer expeditions now, teaching him advanced tracking and survival skills. He played elaborate tea parties with Margaret, his massive frame folded uncomfortably into a tiny chair while she served him imaginary refreshments. He walked the floor with Daniel during teething episodes, singing the same songs he had sung to Thomas years before. Josie marveled at how completely fatherhood suited him, this rough mountain man who had lived alone for so long. He was gentle and patient with the children while still maintaining the strength and protectiveness that defined him. He had found a balance that worked, and their children thrived under his attention. As the children grew older, Josie began teaching them more formally, setting aside time each day for lessons in reading, writing, and arithmetic. She used the books from San Francisco, supplemented with nature studies that Will led. The children learned mathematics through measuring and building, learned biology through observing the animals and plants around them, learned geography by studying maps and understanding where they fit in the larger world. The inheritance Uncle Peter had left them continued to provide security, but more importantly, it gave them choices. When Thomas expressed interest in attending a proper school, they were able to arrange for him to spend winters in Riverside with Mrs. Garcia, attending the new school that had opened there. It was hard for Will to let his firstborn go, even temporarily, but he recognized the value of education and opportunity. Margaret followed her brother's path a few years later, though she proved to be less academically inclined and more interested in learning practical skills. She begged to come home after one winter, declaring that she learned more from her mother's teaching than from any schoolroom. Josie and Will agreed to let her stay home, recognizing that every child was different, every path unique. Daniel, as he grew, showed an interest in drawing and art. He would spend hours sketching the mountains, the animals, the people around him. Will built him a proper desk near the window where the light was best, and Josie ordered art supplies from San Francisco. They encouraged his talent, never trying to force him into a mold that did not fit. The years passed with surprising speed, marked by milestones and memories. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, his skills in the wilderness surpassing even Will's by the time he was 16. Margaret developed into a capable young woman, skilled in all the domestic arts, but also able to shoot and track as well as any man. Daniel remained more cerebral, but he was not weak. He simply expressed his strength differently, through his art and his gentle wisdom. When Thomas turned 18, he announced that he wanted to become a guide, leading hunting and exploration parties through the mountains. Will was proud, recognizing his son's expertise and maturity. They worked together to establish a small business, using connections in San Francisco to advertise Thomas's services. It was successful almost immediately. Wealthy men from the city eager to experience the wilderness under the guidance of someone who truly understood it. Margaret, at 16, fell in love with a young rancher from Riverside, a good man named Samuel who treated her with respect and affection. Will was protective but fair, evaluating Samuel with a critical eye before giving his blessing. The wedding was held at the cabin, with Margaret wearing a dress that Josie had made, this time from proper fabric rather than flour sacks, though Josie had incorporated a panel from her own wedding dress into the bodice, a connection between generations. Daniel, quieter and more reserved than his siblings, found his path through art. At 15, his sketches caught the attention of a visiting photographer from San Francisco, who offered to take him on as an apprentice. It was a difficult decision, requiring Daniel to move to the city, but both Josie and Will recognized the opportunity. They let him go with their blessing and a promise that home would always be waiting. As their children grew and began their own lives, Josie and Will found themselves alone again, much as they had been in the early days of their marriage. But this aloneness was different, richer, layered with years of shared experience and love. They were in their 40s now, still strong and healthy, but with streaks of silver in their hair and lines around their eyes that spoke of years spent laughing and living. They fell into new routines, adapting to life without children underfoot. Will scaled back his work even further, content to manage their property and take occasional expeditions with Thomas. Josie continued to sew and cook, but now she had time for other pursuits. She began writing down the stories of their life, creating a record for their children and future grandchildren. She wanted them to know where they came from, to understand the journey that had brought their family into being. On a summer evening, 20 years after Josie had first arrived in Riverside, she and Will sat on their porch as they had countless times before. Thomas was leading an expedition in the northern mountains. Margaret was home with Samuel and their 2 children on their ranch. Daniel was in San Francisco, building a reputation as a talented photographer. The cabin was quiet, peaceful, filled with memories of the life they had built. "Do you remember the first time we sat here together?" Will asked, his hand finding hers automatically. "I remember. I was nervous, wondering what I had gotten myself into, marrying a stranger. And now? Now I know it was the best decision I ever made. You are the best decision I ever made." He brought her hand to his lips, kissing it gently. "I used to think I was cursed, you know. Everyone I loved died. I thought maybe I was meant to be alone, that caring for people was dangerous. But then you came, and you were so brave and strong, and you stayed. You did not die. You thrived. And you gave me a family, a real family, something I thought I would never have again." "We gave each other a family," Josie corrected. "I was alone too, remember? Lost and scared and desperate. You gave me safety and time and love. You let me heal. You let me become who I was meant to be." Do you ever think about how different things might have been? If Carson had succeeded in killing your father earlier, if you had not found my letter, if you had chosen differently? Sometimes, but I believe we would have found each other somehow. Some things are just meant to be. He smiled at that, the lines around his eyes crinkling in the way she loved. "Fate? Love," she said simply. "Love finds a way." They sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple. Somewhere in the distance they heard the cry of an eagle, wild and free. The stream continued its endless song, and the wind whispered through the pines, and everything was exactly as it should be. "Josie," Will said eventually, his voice soft, "do you still have it?" "Have what?" "Your wedding dress, the one you made from flour sacks." She looked at him in surprise. "Of course I still have it. It is in the trunk in our bedroom, wrapped in paper." "Why?" "I was just thinking about it, about seeing you in it for the first time, standing there in Riverside looking so beautiful and scared and brave. I meant it when I said you looked like an angel. You saved me, Josie. You were my angel." Tears pricked her eyes. Even after all these years, his words could still move her. "Should I get it? Try it on? Would you?" She went inside and retrieved the dress, carefully unwrapping it. The fabric was more fragile now, the embroidery slightly faded, but it was still beautiful in its simplicity. She changed in the bedroom, slipping the dress over her head. It fit differently now. Her body had changed after 3 children in 20 years, but she could still fasten it. She looked at herself in the mirror, seeing not the young, desperate woman who had first worn this dress, but a woman who had lived and loved and built something lasting. When she walked back out onto the porch, Will stood up, and his expression was exactly the same as it had been 2 decades ago, awe and love and wonder. He crossed to her and took her hands, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time all over again. "Still an angel," he murmured. "My angel, my wife, my love." She laughed, a sound of pure joy. "I'm none of those things. I'm just a woman who got lucky enough to find a good man." "You are everything," he said firmly. He pulled her close and they swayed together on the porch, dancing without music, moving to a rhythm only they could hear. It was the same dance they had been doing for 20 years, the give and take of a strong partnership, the balance of two people who fit together perfectly. Later that night, lying in bed with Will's arms around her, Josie thought about the journey that had brought her here. The pain and loss, the fear and uncertainty, the courage it had taken to say yes to a stranger's proposal and travel across the country to an unknown fate. She thought about her father, buried in the hard Colorado ground, and hoped he would be proud of what she had made of her life. She thought about the flour sacks, those humble bits of fabric that had become something beautiful, something meaningful. Life was like that, she reflected. You took what you had, even if it seemed inadequate or plain, and you made something from it. You stitched together moments of joy and sorrow, work and rest, solitude and companionship. You created a pattern that was uniquely yours, and if you were very lucky, you found someone to help you with the sewing, to share the burden of difficult stitches and celebrate the beauty of the finished work. She had been so lucky. Against all odds, in the hardest of circumstances, she had found love. Not the fairy tale kind that existed in storybooks, but the real kind that grew through shared work and honest conversation and mutual respect. The kind that lasted through childbirth and sickness, through disagreements and reconciliations, through the mundane dailiness of life. The kind that made you look at someone after 20 years and still feel your heart skip a beat. Will's breathing had deepened into sleep, but his arms remained around her, protective even in unconsciousness. She pressed a soft kiss to his chest and closed her eyes, feeling grateful for every moment that had led her here, to this bed, this cabin, this life. The years continued to pass, bringing new joys and inevitable sorrows. Thomas married a woman from San Francisco, a teacher named Elizabeth who loved the mountains as much as he did. They had 3 children who spent their summers at their grandparents' cabin, learning the same skills Will had taught their father. Margaret and Samuel's family grew to include 4 children, and the ranch became a gathering place for family celebrations. Daniel never married, but he found fulfillment in his art, capturing the beauty of the American West in photographs that gained acclaim throughout the country. Josie and Will grew older together, their bodies slowing but their love remaining constant. They took shorter walks now, moved more carefully, but they still sat on their porch every evening, still held hands, still talked for hours about everything and nothing. Will's hair turned completely silver, and Josie developed arthritis in her hands that made sewing difficult. But they adapted, finding new ways to express their love and care for each other. When Will turned 65, he announced that he was officially retiring from trapping. "I have been doing this for 40 years, he said. "I think it is time to let the younger generation take over. I want to spend my time with you, Josie, just you and me and this mountain." She agreed wholeheartedly. They had earned their rest, earned the right to simply exist together without the pressure of work and responsibility. They spent their days in peaceful routine, tending the garden, reading together, entertaining the parade of grandchildren who visited regularly, and always, always sitting together as the sun set, grateful for another day in paradise. On their 30th wedding anniversary, their children organized a celebration that brought the entire extended family to the mountain cabin. It was chaos and noise and joy, children running everywhere, adults catching up, food covering every available surface. Josie looked around at the crowd and marveled at what had grown from that one brave decision to say yes to a stranger's proposal. Thomas stood to give a toast, tall and confident like his father. 30 years ago, my mother got on a train and traveled west to marry a man she had never met. It was an act of courage and faith that I am not sure I could replicate. And my father, who had been alone for so long, took a chance on love again, opening his heart to a woman who came with nothing but a bag of belongings and a dress made from flour sacks. The crowd laughed, and Josie saw several people glance at the framed photographs on the wall, including one that Daniel had taken years ago of Josie wearing her wedding dress. "What they built from that unlikely beginning is remarkable," Thomas continued. A partnership based on mutual respect and genuine love. A family that spans generations. A legacy of strength and kindness that each of us carries forward. Mom, Dad, thank you for showing us what real love looks like. Thank you for building a home where everyone is welcome, where love is freely given, where hard work and honest living are valued above all else. Happy anniversary. Everyone raised their glasses, and Josie wiped away tears as Will squeezed her hand. They cut into a beautiful cake that Margaret had made, and the party continued late into the night, filled with music and dancing and the kind of happiness that comes from being surrounded by people you love. When everyone had finally gone home or settled into various sleeping spots throughout the expanded cabin, Josie and Will escaped to their porch, needing a moment of quiet after the wonderful chaos of the day. 30 years, Will said, shaking his head in wonder. It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time. I know exactly what you mean. She leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting into his side as perfectly as she always had. We have built something good, have we not? The best, better than I ever dreamed possible. He turned to look at her, his hazel eyes still bright despite his age. I love you, Josie. I have loved you for 30 years, and I will love you for however many more we are given. You are my heart, my home, my everything. And you are mine, she whispered. Always and forever, you are mine. They kissed, slow and sweet, a kiss that spoke of decades of intimacy and devotion. When they finally went inside, walking hand in hand to their bedroom, Josie paused to look at the photograph of herself in her flower sack wedding dress. She touched the frame gently, remembering that frightened young woman so unsure of her future. I hope she knows how well it turned out, she murmured. Who? Will asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. That girl in the picture. I hope she knows that saying yes was the right choice, that taking the risk was worth it, that everything scary and uncertain led to this beautiful life. She knows, Will said confidently. She is you, and you have lived it. You know better than anyone how worth it all was. She turned in his arms and kissed him again. Yes, I do. Every struggle, every fear, every challenge, all of it was worth it to end up here, with you. They lived peacefully for another decade, their love story becoming the stuff of family legend. The children and grandchildren never tired of hearing about how Josie had sewn her wedding dress from flour sacks, how Will had called her an angel, how they had built a life from nothing but determination and love. The story was retold at family gatherings, embellished slightly with each telling but always maintaining the essential truth, that love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances, and that taking a chance on someone could change everything. When Will passed away at 76, peacefully in his sleep with Josie beside him, the family mourned deeply, but also celebrated a life well lived. He had been a good man, a loving husband, a devoted father and grandfather. He had faced hardship and loss and loneliness, and he had overcome it all to create something beautiful. His funeral was held in Riverside, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched in various ways. Josie buried him on the mountain he had loved, in a spot overlooking the valley with the cabin visible below. She planted wildflowers on his grave and visited every day, talking to him as if he could still hear, telling him about the children and grandchildren, about the changing seasons, about how much she missed him. She lived for another 5 years, remaining in the cabin despite her children's efforts to convince her to move closer to town. This is where I belong, she insisted. This is where we built our life, where we raised our family, where we loved each other. I am not leaving. She spent her final years in peaceful reflection, writing down the last of her memories, ensuring that nothing of their story would be lost. She sewed when her hands allowed it, still finding comfort in the familiar motion of needle and thread. She tended Will's grave and the garden. She welcomed visits from family and friends, always ready with a story or a meal or a listening ear. On a spring morning, 41 years after she had first arrived in Riverside as a frightened bride, Josie passed away in her sleep. Her family found her lying peacefully in the bed she had shared with Will for so many years, a smile on her face as if she had seen something beautiful in her final moments. On the table beside the bed was her wedding dress, the flour sack dress that had started it all, laid out as if she had wanted to see it one more time. They buried her beside Will on the mountain, and the entire family gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had been the heart of their family. Thomas, now in his 50s, spoke about his mother's courage and strength. Margaret talked about her kindness and wisdom. Daniel, whose photographs of his parents had become famous, shared stories of their love. The grandchildren spoke of cookie recipes and bedtime stories and the warm hugs that had made everything better. And as the sun set over the mountain, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the family stood together, united in their grief but also in their gratitude. Josie and Will had given them an incredible gift, the example of true love, the legacy of a life well lived, the proof that taking chances and choosing love could lead to extraordinary happiness. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through generations, always maintained and cherished. The flour sack wedding dress was preserved and displayed, a tangible reminder of where it all began. And the story lived on, told and retold, a testament to the power of love to transform lives, to turn humble materials into something beautiful, to create miracles from the most unlikely beginnings. Josie O'Brien, who had sewn her own wedding dress from flour sacks and married a mountain man who thought she looked like an angel, had lived a life of purpose and passion. She had loved deeply and been deeply loved in return. She had built a family and a legacy that would endure for generations. She had taken the raw materials of her life, the grief and fear and uncertainty, and stitched them into something magnificent. And in the end, that was all anyone could ask for. A life well lived, a love well tended, and a legacy that would outlast the physical body. Josie and Will had created all of that and more, proving that sometimes the best stories start with the simplest materials and the bravest choices. Their love story, born from flour sacks and faith, had become something eternal, woven into the fabric of their family's history and the mountains they had called home.